and welcome to the Unitarian Universalist Congregation of Lake County. I'm delighted to see all of you here on this beautiful, rather brisk morning. I am Janine Reagan, and I will be your service leader for today. Reverend Lori Staubitz is our guest minister this morning. And just a little tech tip for all of you. You have two viewing options for the service: speaker view, which highlights the person speaking, and gallery view, which shows you everyone who is on the link today. You will find the options on the label view somewhere in the outer edge of your screen. It's usually in the upper right-hand corner, but you may have to look around for it depending on your device. Thank you for joining us this morning, and I will begin with a few announcements. Our service is being recorded except for joys and concerns and for the discussion after the service. You will find this service and several of our earlier services on our YouTube channel, UUCLC Office, which you can access from our weekly bulletin or our website at lakecountyuu.net. The chat box on Zoom is open. You may take some time at this point, early in the service, to enter a joy or a concern which is too tender to speak aloud, and it will be read during that part of the service. You may also enter a donation into the funding link, which is also in the chat box. Our tech team that is responsible for our Zoom services and our social justice Zoom presentations is looking for a couple of volunteers to join our team. New volunteers will be trained in the basic skills of admitting participants and screening the gallery for people who wish to speak during special times like joys and concerns or during discussion period. If you're interested or have questions about this, please contact Val Rosado. Does anyone else have an announcement today?
I do. Back in November, UU had a bake sale and fundraiser that benefited Lake Cares, it's the food pantry, and Open Door, which is a drop-in shelter. And we raised close to $600 the week before Thanksgiving. And guess what? Valentine's Day, we're going to do it again, so you can treat your person who's a honey to a treat. And we can raise some more money for those two worthy causes. Please join us at 3 to 4:30. We need people who will bring things to sell, to eat and sell, and we need people who will bring some money to spend. See you then. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Bernie. Is there anybody else with an announcement today?
Can I piggyback off of Bernie?
Sure.
Hi. We will, today is the day to drop off donations for Lake Cares and Open Doors, and I'll be at the church in the parking lot from 3 to 4, and the bulletin has a whole list of things that you can bring, and we're going to join Bernie on Valentine's Day and do the same thing in February. We do this once a month, and I have to tell you, last month you guys were so generous, and I know some of you donate online, and that's awesome. And I know some of you are uncomfortable shopping, but if you want to drop by a check or cash, we'll take that too. So I hope to see some folks. I look forward to it because I get to see some of y'all. Thanks.
Thanks, Jane. Anybody else? Welcome to this place of possibility. This is Love's Hearth, the home of hope, a refuge for minds in search of truth unfolding, ever beautiful, ever strange. Here, compassion is our shelter, freedom our protection from the storms of bigotry and hate. In this abode, may we find comfort and courage. Here, may our sight become vision to see the unseen, to glimpse the good that is yet to be. Welcome to all. If you are a first-time visitor or perhaps returning after a long absence, if you are comfortable doing so, I invite you to wave your hand at the camera so all can see you. and a member of our tech staff will call on you. Then you may unmute and introduce yourself and tell us what brought you here today. Do we have any visitors or anybody returning? Okay, nobody today.
Diana has her hand up and she
Okay,
can unmute.
I'm waving to my namesake here from Albion, Diana the First. I'm Diana the Second.
I guess I'm a visitor. Am I unmuted?
Yes.
Well, I guess I'm a visitor, having been invited by Diana the second. Actually, I was a second child, so I always still feel like I'm a second in command or something. But anyway, so I wanted to hear Lori's message, and so it's just wonderful, isn't it, being able to do this? Zoom in. I played a game with some grandchildren of mine last night called Scattergories or something like that, and it was such fun. We did it on Zoom, and you make up words that begin with a certain letter, and it was really lots of fun. So I think this is the little silver lining of all this pandemic and everything. So I'm happy to be here.
anyone else? Well, if anyone is interested in receiving our monthly newsletter or weekly bulletin, or having someone from our membership committee contact you, or if you're interested in learning more about Unitarian Universalism or our community here at UUCLC, please send us an email at office@lakecountyuu.net, or leave your email in the chat and someone will contact you. Lori Staubitz is an ordained Unitarian Universalist minister who has been serving congregations professionally for 20 years. As you probably saw in this week's bulletin, Reverend Lori has a very diverse and impressive background. She earned her Master's of Divinity at Virginia Union University School of Theology, a traditional African-American theological school in Richmond, Virginia. She also has experience in leadership development, social justice, and pastoral counseling. Reverend Lori continues as a professional minister with Pullman Memorial Universalist Church in Albion, New York, for a monthly worship service. She is a consultant for the Central Eastern region of UUA and has a ministry with the UUA Office of Advocacy and Witness. In addition, she serves as a mentor for developing ministers. This is a very busy lady. Reverend Lori and her husband are organic gardeners, avid kayakers, and she is a musician. They live in Western New York. Reverend Lori.
Thank you very much. And it's so good to be with everybody. And I want to say, one of the beauties of this very challenging time is that we can be together in this way across the nation and indeed across the world. And so I invite you to think about that expansion of community and togetherness, and invite you to begin this portion of our worship service by with a meditation in song. Now, stay muted because that is the only way we can sing together. But you may know this out of the Teal hymnal. It's a meditation on breathing, and I'm going to do 3 different parts, and then you can choose your part. So take a deep breath in and a deep breath out, and envision this circle that we are a part of this morning and how very large it is. When I breathe in peace. When I breathe out love. When I breathe in peace. When I breathe out love. Breathe in. Breathe out, breathe in, breathe out. So join me when I breathe in. I breathe in peace when I breathe out. I breathe out love when I breathe in. I breathe in peace when I breathe out. I breathe out love. Breathe in, breathe out, breathe in, breathe out. This hour we come together to renew our faith in the wholeness, in the goodness, and the beauty of life. We gather to reaffirm the way of the open heart and the open mind and the compassionate response. So let us enter into this time of worship so we may better kindle hope and reclaim a vision of a world made fair and all her beings one. Come, let us worship together. And please feel free to sing along and even do the hand motions as we listen to Spirit of Life.
Each Sunday, we make time for those who wish to offer a joy, a concern, or a sorrow, or to set an intention for the coming days. This portion of our service will not be recorded while we enjoy this beautiful rendition of Sometimes I Feel Like a Motherless Child. So please get comfortable and spend this time in whatever way helps you to calm your mind.
Sometimes I feel like a motherless child. Sometimes I feel like a motherless child. Sometimes I feel like a motherless child. A long way from home, my home, a long way from
Please join me in reaffirming who we are by reciting together our congregational covenant found on the screen. Love is the spirit of this church, and service is its law. This is our great covenant, to dwell together in peace, to seek the truth in love, and to help one another. It is our practice to give generously to our church as we are able, and keeping in mind both its meaning in our lives and its impact in the world. We are thankful to all who provide financial support for UUCLC. In order to continue our virtual services and keep our beautiful building protected and ready for our eventual return, we ask for whatever financial support you can provide. There are multiple ways to do this, and they are found on the slide on your screen, in the Sunday bulletin, or on the UUCLC website. You can also donate from the link in the chat box today. Thank you for your donations.
Good morning again. I'm Reverend Lori Staubitz, if you joined us a little bit later. I venture to guess that most of us here today are at least a little proud of our open-mindedness and our willingness to be inclusive and to seek out diversity in whatever form we are able in our lives. And we're in good company. We have been doing this for a long time as Unitarian Universalists. However, we are far from where we need to be or want to be. So I wanted to spend a little bit of this morning framing a little bit of our history. I know in 1992 in Calgary at General Assembly, there was a radical shift away from how we were to how we hoped we would be. And there was a call for us to become an inclusive, diverse community. The term beloved community started to be used quite a bit to name that vision. And we were asked to start to model and reflect within our congregations a racially and multicultural diversity so that we would look like a global village. Well, that's when we started to include hymns from other cultures. We started to look at our worship services to shake things up a bit. And indeed, many of our congregations were shook it up a bit. But 4 years later, in General Assembly here in Rochester, I'm not too far from Rochester right now, up here in upstate New York, there was another shift. And they said, you know, to become more radically and culturally diverse as an association, we must move maybe a little bit further from just becoming a multicultural center for worship and for some of the things we do. That there was a push to actively become engaged in anti-racism work, that to just be passive about it and think that, well, if we do a little bit of this, a little bit of that, you know, people will feel comfortable being with us. There was a radical shift, and it was entitled The Journey Towards Wholeness. And some of you might have participated in the many different aspects of that. And so we were being pushed a little bit further than beyond the confines of just our congregational life, building a village. And the plan was to move away from this idea of being helpers and providing social service support to actually starting to look at personal and interpersonal transformation. So, and you know, this is where we are right now, again, as we are still being called forward, not to help we are being asked to be changed, that we transform internally, not only as individuals, but as congregations. Now, I know that most of us don't even identify as racist, and in fact have worked hard to push back against racism. However, in our day-to-day experiences, and also within our communities and within the kind of, and in the grocery stores and in our social gatherings, the global village concept has not become a reality. We are very far from that. But I think if our congregations have this dream of diversity, many of us have been caught still dreaming. And it's hard to know how to move out of this. Many attempts have been made, and yet we still seem to struggle. Rosemary Bray McNatt is a colleague and a Unitarian Universalist minister and an African American woman, and she has been serving at Star King. And she said in her writing, Been in the Storm Too Long, she says, she asked this question: why are we still talking about inclusivity and diversity when we have done little to make them real? Diversity and inclusivity are terribly hard and terribly uncomfortable and definitely unsettling and often quite frustrating. And so if you've participated, you know that's true. She said, the truth is if there's no justice, there can be no peace. We can read Thoreau and Emerson to one another and quote Rilke and Alice Walker and Howard Thurman and think good thoughts and noble thoughts, but we cannot bring justice into our small circle in our own lives. If we can't do that, how do we hope to bring justice into the world? And so I know the examination that each one of us is being asked to make about race, no matter what your ethnicity or your cultural background, that we all have this human capacity to separate ourselves out from the greater human family. And indeed, we do that even in the family of life. And so we're being asked to look at that kind of privilege. But, as a minister, I have been asked to participate and have indeed participated in 20 years or more of anti-racism training. And I did find much of it unsettling, that as we tried to overcome our racism, we seemed like we were inflicting deeper wounds upon one another. Honest reflections by whites and, confirmed some of the horrors of racism within families, within our own thoughts, and really did amplify to many of us how pervasive racism is. And so many have gone down that road of guilt, as well as rage, and further divisions have happened. So it can feel overwhelming, and I think it is. I think it is overwhelming. However, I think there's a way. I think there's a way for us to do multiple things. But today I wanted to just share a little bit of a path forward that I believe may be helpful to add to all the other efforts and all the other paths that we're being asked to consider. A way out of both guilt and our white fragility, that our defensiveness, to possibly get further along the path of this work that is going to extend far beyond our own lifetimes. So I want to share with you a bit of obscure history that I discovered while I was in Meadville, Lombard, doing work up there while I was developing in ministry, I came across a story. At the turn of the 19th century, Unitarian Universalists were living out their faith as mission-based social reform. And they were vehicles for addressing injustice, issues around labor, education, public health, women's rights, and racial justice. So as a daughter of abolitionists and an early pioneer in ministry, Celia Parker Woolley was successful in establishing settlement work as an outgrowth of her parish ministry. And she was doing this in the Midwest. As a longtime resident of Chicago and an elite, she was active in the Women's Club. And she had a reputation, even within that club, as a social reformer, particularly around women's issues and justice for African Americans. So she upset the upper crust of Chicago high society in her day by introducing a motion into the Women's Club for them to embrace a motto. And that motto was, "Nothing human is alien to us." I love it. Nothing human is alien to us. And after, of course, heated battle, Celia won, and the bylaws were amended. And that is when Fannie Barrier Williams stepped up to become the first African-American woman to join. She was Celia Parker's friend and colleague. And they would, I think it was Woolley who pointed to that. She did many things in her life, but Celia Parker Woolley pointed to that particular event as the single most satisfying event of her lifetime. And these women would go on together to do much to address integration. They met at All Souls Unitarian Church in Chicago, and they developed a friendship. There was an age, Celia Parker was much older than our Fannie Barrier Williams was, but they forged a friendship. And knowing the power of her pastorate, because she was preaching there, she repeatedly offered her pulpit to Fannie. And together they started to make some changes. So after years of attempts to raise social consciousness within churches, Celia Parker Woolley left the ministry. She left the pastorate. And she said this, and maybe you can relate to this as well, even now. She said, religious liberals were stranded in an area of individualism and were too self-absorbed and disconnected. And she went on to say, all they could do was touch fingertips with gloves on at that. Unfortunately, Celia Parker Woolley might say the same thing about us today. That in 1905, Parker went ahead and she moved her family out of the Grand Boulevard district in Chicago to the South Side. Granted, her family members were none too pleased about this zealous move and risking their social status, but she was pretty a force of nature, and so they did. They moved. So with Fannie Barrier Williams at her side, the two women set out to set up a center, and where, in their words, the best, which we might not use that word today, but the best that whites and blacks had to offer could come together on common ground to promote common aspirations and action. So their goal was to bring the two communities together at a time where this was unheard of and everything was working against this. But they went on to promote poetry readings, lectures, concerts, and teas that brought the social groups together and created a center that was clearly diverse and multicultural in their day. And this was a real departure from the social reform technique of coming in with privilege and with power to help the disadvantaged. It was far from seeing that the role of white liberals was to uplift the disadvantaged in a way that promoted this idea that there was something to be gained by having real relationships based on mutuality, on reciprocity that could be nurtured and sustained. Out of this center that they created, the Frederick Douglass Center would become known as a social club. And it was the beginning and the foundation for what would later be the Urban League and the NAACP. Who knew there were two women at the heart of that movement? But it sounds like this all happened very smoothly without a lot of pain. But like each of us, these two women were not without their shortcomings. Celia Parker Woolley continued to be confronted by the effects of her influence, her power, and her class relationships with her friend Fanny. She often found herself at social functions that were not open to Fanny, and yet she would go. Contemporary historians have called into question Woolley's sincerity, citing her reassurance to whites at the time that she was only bringing the classes together for non-intimate ways. There was a lot of fear about public mixing, and she wanted to make clear that she wasn't trying to promote that. So there was definitely still residual racism on her part. But Fanny Barrier Williams, on the other hand, she got attacked from the African-American community and was sharply criticized for participating in what was seen as elite social gatherings when so much need existed. So both of these women had pushback from their respective ethnic communities. But in spite of it all, they went on to institutionalize the Frederick Douglass Center and forged an abiding friendship. And I think that's the piece that I want to lift up this morning, is that they were able to transcend a lot of boundaries in their day. So I do think that at the heart of trying to dismantle racism is this concept of authentic relationship. It's sometimes being a white woman, you know, in the past, it's like, well, yeah, I know this Black person, and you know, we've been in a social setting together. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the kind of friendships that we have created, the deep and abiding ones that we have created with one another in our families and in our towns, to actually think about forging that kind of relationship. You know, a few years ago, just speaking from my own experience, I set out on my own journey across the color lines in the capital of the Confederacy, Richmond, Virginia. And my motivation was simple. I needed to go to an economically feasible, accredited theological school that would enable me to work full-time as a religious educator. I was working at the First Unitarian Church in Richmond. I had 3 children, and I was a single mother, so needed to work and also pursue my master's in divinity. So I ended up at Virginia Union University And that was clearly African American. And I look back at some of the ignorant assumptions that I made, some of which were, won't it be wonderful? You know, these people, it would be nice for them to know that not all whites, you know, are racist. Well, more often than not, I was the only white person in the room, and very acutely aware immediately of my privilege. That I was shocked by even my public education that I received, how that far outweighed anything that my colleagues had experienced in rural Black schools, many of who came up from the Carolinas. I know I had a patronizing kind of benevolence, you know, about my being there. And what I soon discovered is that my presence was not needed, nor was it particularly wanted. And I had to work very hard to forge any kind of relationship. There was a lot of suspicion, and rightfully so, about my being there. And I was shocked to find out that a lot of my colleagues, African-American colleagues, had never been in a situation with someone of my color. That is how isolated some of the pockets in our communities throughout this nation, that there are whole towns where you do not have to interact with anyone from another race. And we know that's true of white culture, but that was also true for a lot of these small rural towns down in the South. I also, I learned that this idea of violence against Black communities, and mind you, this was back in 2000, okay, this is now 21 years ago, that on Friday nights, it was a sport for young white rebel types to take their shotguns and their beer and drive through African-American communities and shoot. That was a sport that was allowed. And some of my colleagues had lost family members to this random gunfire. So the suppression was very evident even back then. Very few people knew about those kinds of stories because they certainly weren't being reported by the police. There are very many events that took place during my time at Virginia Union. You know, one of the things that a pastor professor had asked us to do was a genogram outlining our family history. And of course, I had all this, information going back, to the 1600s. So it took me forever. And my colleagues, not so. Many of them couldn't even trace back their lineage beyond a grandparent or a great-grandparent. And then that gave way to the talk about family systems and how the effects of racism and hatred for African Americans had been internalized within families, so that when light-colored children were born, they were more revered and more welcomed and wanted than the dark baby was. How within the African American community, the punitive nature of discipline had been internalized, that the harshness in which children were being treated, and this pain that I heard, just shocked me to know that it's not just the pain upon which these communities are being heaped, it's the pain from within as well, as all this history has been internalized. But there was one event that really brought things home to me, and that was a night after a theological discussion. A group of us left the building and went into the parking lot to continue our discussion because they were closing up the building. And, Virginia Union, of course, sits in a very impoverished area of Richmond and violent area of the city. But I hadn't experienced any need for concern. So one by one, people were leaving the discussion until I was in this parking lot with one of my colleagues, an African-American preacher from South Carolina. And we were really engaged in a wonderful discussion. Then all of a sudden he stopped and he said, "Oh my God, you don't know how dangerous this is right now." And I looked around and I'm like, I don't see anything to be concerned about. And he said, "Oh no, you don't understand." He said, "Any cop riding by this parking lot right now would have me arrested and locked up for the rest of my life just for having a conversation with you, to being alone at night with a white woman." That is still true. It's still true, So there were so many events that made me realize how difficult, how risky it is for people of color to forge relationships with people who are white. There are so many risks. But I think that the hope I have is that through trying to forge these relationships, that something will emerge that I think is extremely important. This idea of doing anti-racism work is the work of justice that we need to do. But the piece that doesn't seem to come through, and it did for me, is the quality and the beauty of the gifts that come from that culture. And it's not just a single culture, it's cultures, just like white culture has multiple cultures. It's just that we don't talk about how wonderful and rich and varied. We certainly know from music and some from food, but there's so many things, like the being immersed in the quality of music and worship that I had when I was with the Virginia Union for 4 years. And the relational piece, there was a much more relaxed intergenerational, kind of, I don't know, I want to call it kindness that I don't see in my own culture. There, for example, there would be someone that was struggling and the sense of time was altered. Like if you came upon someone who was struggling, you helped them before you went on to make the time for that meeting. So often there was this waiting for people to show up, and you'd find out, well, but this came up. So very different ways of being. But I wanted to just close with some ideas, and certainly a quote from Howard Thurman, who has been a source for me for many years. And he wrote a reflection, "If I Knew You." He said, "Often the degree to which we oppose a thing marks the degree to which we do not understand it. We express our dislike for things when we do not know the people for whom we have the antagonism. But one has to pay a price for understanding. It takes time, effort, and imagination. And it does not come merely for the asking. One has to circle around the outer edges of another's life to get closer and closer and closer to the center in order to truly know anything at all about the other." And so, dear folks, as we all continue the work of doing anti-racism, anti-oppression work. They also look for ways to forge relationships and see how that might unfold, knowing that fear exists on both sides of the aisle when it comes to that. And so I would like to invite you to join in singing our closing hymn, which I think speaks to this constant ongoing journey that we participate in, it expanding the circle. And that's really all we are ever going to be able to do, is just to keep pressing that out and out. So please join as we sing Circle Round for Freedom, number 155 in our hymnal. But I know that we have a beautiful video for that. Thank you.
Circle round for freedom, circle round for peace, for all of us imprisoned, circle for release, circle for the planet, circle for each soul, for the children of our children, keep the circle whole. Circle round for freedom, circle round for peace, for all of us imprisoned, circle for release, circle for the planet, circle for each soul, for the children of our children, keep the circle whole. Circle round for freedom, circle round for peace, for all of us imprisoned, circle for release, circle for the planet, circle for each soul, for the children of our children, keep the circle whole.
May we continue to kindle this fire and gather to love anew as the lifeblood of generations who refuse to surrender their humanity courses through our veins. Let our despair be transformed into hope as we begin anew the legacy and light of love and caring. Words by Thendanka. We extinguish this chalice, but not the light of love and commitment.
We close our service as we weave together a fabric of unity and love to the song of Weave. You are invited to raise your hands and join me in singing at home. If you are in the gallery view on Zoom, you will be able to raise your hands together.